Hi, good evening everyone. Welcome to the Kent Archaeological Society monthly online talk. It's a great pleasure this month to be joined by my colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Blanning. And she has been a trustee of the Kent Archaeological Society for a number of years. Elizabeth, just to say a few words about her, studied music at the Royal Holloway College at the University of London. And then after some years in Tokyo, she returned to the UK, where she embarked on an archaeological degree at the University of Kent part-time with a BA and an MA, and then graduating with a doctorate in classical and archaeological studies in 2015. And her thesis was Landscape, Settlement and Materiality, Aspects of Rural Life in Kent during the Roman period. And this actually won the Kent Archaeological Society Hasted Prize. Today, she will be talking with Jo Ahmet, who she'll introduce in a little bit, about one of the, currently potential acquisitions of the Kent Archaeological Society collection. We have an extensive collection. She will say something about that as our curator, our honorary curator. This is an item of early medieval jewellery, which is going from private ownership, hopefully, to the Kent Archaeological to go on display as part of our collection. And she, as she will introduce, will be talking to Kent Finds Liaison Officer Jo Ahmet. So I will now hand over to Elizabeth. This talk is one of a series the Kent Archaeological Society is doing. We exist and have existed for many decades to encourage wider research and education and understanding of the historic archaeology and the kind of history of Kent, the ancient county of Kent. And we would really welcome your engagement if you're not members, to think about becoming members, and also to follow us online. We'd really be happy and keen to extend our networks and membership. And so we're really grateful for those who are not members tonight to consider that, and for those who are members, it's a very warm welcome to you. So now I will pass over to Dr. Elizabeth Blanning. Thank you very much.
Hello, and a very warm welcome from me as well. Jo and I are going to talk to you tonight about treasure, and I feel I should say at the outset that although this is billed as a curator talk, Jo, for very good reasons, is going to do most of the heavy lifting. You'll see why later. The reason that we're going to talk about treasure, as Kerry has indicated, is that, in fact, this is breaking news. We are not in the process of acquiring. We now actually officially do own a significant and very interesting, recently discovered item of medieval jewellery. The confirmation came through this afternoon, so I was very pleased about that. As many of you will know, the Society already has an important collection of early medieval artefacts. These are mostly from the cemeteries at Bifrons, Sarr and Lyminge. And I'm sure many of you will have seen items from this collection on display in Maidstone Museum. Now, the object we're going to be talking about tonight was found by a metal detectorist, Paul Haig, and I believe Paul is with us tonight, so welcome, Paul. Paul reported it to the Portable Antiquities Scheme, and it duly went through the treasure process. So at this point, I would really like to thank Paul for making sure that this piece of Kent's history and archaeology was saved and made available for study, and eventually, we hope, for display. And as I expect Jo will tell us, this hasn't always been the case with similar items in the past. So the item is a pendant, it's a cross, it's made of gold, set with garnets. It's a type of artefact which is well recognised but not particularly common. And it is, I think, quite an important class of artefact which has a lot to tell us about society at the time it was made. But having picked it up and called it treasure and telling you it's important and uncommon, I'm now going to say don't be disappointed when you see it's also extremely incomplete. I expect some of you may have seen in the papers recently a piece of research that said the secret of happiness is to lower your expectations. And that's been one of my rules of life for a long time, and I can assure you it works. So lower your expectations and prepare to be wowed. This is the cross. And now, as you can see, if you took this down to your friendly neighbourhood early medieval jeweller, all he'd give you would be scrap value. But for archaeologists, treasure isn't found in gold, it isn't found in jewels, it's found in what an object can teach us. What does it tell us about its owner, about the person who commissioned it, the person who made it, how it was made, where the raw materials came from, the trading connections these imply? What does the biography of the object tell us? What was its journey from the craftsman's bench to its eventual destruction and discard? What does it say about society at the time? As archaeologists, we study people, but through the lens of the objects that they left behind, like this one. So this beautiful but very damaged object actually holds a whole treasure house of information, far beyond its intrinsic value as gold and garnet. And Joe will unpack this for us later. Now, I was so glad that Joe agreed to present tonight, because he's not only our local flow, he's a specialist in early medieval jewellery, and his research focuses particularly on garnets, so he's ideally suited to interpret this find. Now, when I first saw this image, my first reaction was wow. The second was, what a shame it's so damaged. My third thought, as the KAS curator, was, if that were whole, we could never afford it. And finally, I thought it would be lovely to be able to see it as it was originally. And so I put some thought into how we could have a reconstruction made. First of all, I was looking at having the possibility of having a copy made by a jeweller who specialises in replicas of ancient pieces. But there were some problems with that idea, not least in replicating the shape of the central garnet, and that, as we will hear, is significant. So then I thought of my talented friend, Mr. Lloyd Bosworth. And I should perhaps mention here that we've also just welcomed Lloyd as a new trustee of the KAS. Now, some of you might have seen that wonderful turning 3D model of the bridge helmet on the Canterbury Roman Museum website. Well, that's one of his creations. So who better, I thought, to approach to see if we could get a replica of the Elham Cross. And this is the result, which I think you'll agree is absolutely stupendous. I am so grateful to Lloyd. It's a good thing he enjoys doing things like this, because I can't begin to imagine how many hours or days he put into this, all in his own time, I might add. And I know from the correspondence we've had over the last weeks that it certainly has been a lot, and I owe him more than a few drinks. So here it is alongside the original. And this reconstruction is informed by other examples of similar items, and in particular a cross found at Thurnham near Maidstone, which I'm sure Joe will speak about later. And Lloyd has also done a second reconstruction to show how it might have been worn as part of a composite necklace. Now, obviously we don't know that if it was worn like this. There is an example in the British Museum of a cross on a similar necklace, although they might actually have been two separate items. We don't know, but it's quite nice to flesh the image out, so to speak. Although I believe the flesh and the clothing actually caused Lloyd an awful lot more trouble than reconstructing the cross itself, and I'm really rather lucky that he's still speaking to me. Right, so that's a basic introduction to the cross, and in due course I'm going to hand over to Joe to talk in more depth about it. But before that, I wanted to take the opportunity to ask him some questions about the journey that this object took from when it was found to the KAS acquiring it, and about the treasure process in general, because most of us don't have direct experience of it. And as you might know, there are changes afoot. So, welcome, Joe. It's very nice to have you here this evening, and I'm very, very grateful for your participation in all of this. So do you want to start? I think you prepared some slides to illustrate the things we're discussing. So if you want to start sharing.
So yeah. Well, thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to the questions, both from you, Elizabeth, and from our audience, as well as getting to talk about this fantastic object.
Okay, Joe, so just to begin with, how long have you been our flow?
Officially since I think June 2017.
Right, so you've been with us quite a while now. Right.
Yeah.
And the first thing I knew about this cross was when I got one of the occasional emails I get from you saying, "Please come and speak urgently." So could you fill in some of the bit of the background and tell us something about how this discovery was actually made and about how you first came to hear about it?
Yeah. So as the kind of day-to-day running of the PAS in Kent, I spent a lot of time answering emails, and just happening to check one of my emails from the finder saying, "Oh, I think I've got a bit of Anglo-Saxon gold here," and I was like, "Okay." Often I get emails like that, and it's not what what is suggested, or it's something else, or not gold. But as soon as I saw this image, which the finder took and had sent to me, straight away, just looking at that kind of beautiful twisted gold wire filigree and those garnets, I knew he knew exactly what he'd found. And that was at the beginning of February 2018. Unfortunately, we haven't got any pictures of it in the field. Often we have a picture of the finder showing it off to the camera. But in this case, there was a rather, I think, quite a brutal hailstorm going on. And so it was a question of making sure both the finder and the object got back to their car safely. So it was found in the parish of Elham. This is one of the largest parishes in the county, which is the only reason I'm saying its name, because as it's so large, it'll be difficult to track down exactly where the find spot is, and obviously we have considerations about protecting that find spot. Paul emailed me where we'd found it, and we made sure we had all the information to report to the coroner, which is part of the treasure process, which I'm sure we'll get to. And then we just had to arrange handing it over to me.
Okay, so what happened next? What are the processes that something like this has to go through, and how does the value get put on it?
So the treasure process can be quite long, and I have a set of slides, hopefully, that will show off how this is. So it's split roughly into four phases. There's the first stage, which is the initial reporting, which is making sure we've got all the information that we need to get it legally reported to the coroner. So this includes the find spot, when the object was found, so the coroner can see that the finder got in contact with them, or indeed me, within the 14 days allotted under the Treasure Act. The finder's details and the landowner's details, as well as any occupier that may be present. This is then sent to the British Museum, where they issue what's called a treasure number. In this case, it's 2018. Off the top of my head, I can't remember what the rest of the number is, but I'm sure it'll pop up again. And then we enter the kind of bare bones of this information onto the Portable Antiquities Scheme's publicly accessible database. The next stage is writing the official report on the object. This will be a report that is either written by the curators of the British Museum or approved by the curatorial staff of the British Museum. And this fulfills an element of the Treasure Act to kind of prove that the object is treasure. In this case, I wrote the report and submitted it to Dr. Sue Blanng, the early medieval curator at the British Museum, who approved it with very few alterations. The next stage, and this is what the final database entry for the Elham Cross looks like. So this is all visible on the PAS database and is effectively a carbon copy of the treasure report that is submitted to the curatorial staff. The next phase is stage 3, which is the local interest. This is the stage in which we look to discuss the acquisition of the object with local institutions. These institutions generally have to be accredited by the Museums Association, which means in Kent we have quite large gaps across the county in terms of coverage, because most museums have a set acquisitions area or a particular period that they're interested in. So for Maidstone, it's the early medieval. For Canterbury, it's Canterbury district as a whole. For Dover, it's Dover district and the Bronze Age in East Kent. So For the Elham Cross in this phase, Maidstone Museum initially expressed an interest, which means we then go on to the final phase, which is the outcomes. Now this is split in two, which is no museum interest, in which case the Crown's interest, which oversees the Treasure Act, is disclaimed, or there is interest, with which means the case goes to a formal inquest with the coroner, who decides whether the object is legally treasure and whether or not it should go on to be valued, and then the museum requested to pay this valuation. The coroner makes the decision based on evidence provided by myself or the curatorial staff at the British Museum, although the landowner and the finder are allowed to add anything that they wish to at that stage, as well as the Treasure Valuation Committee, which is part of this last phase. And this is how valuation is put on an object. So the archaeological importance of the object is considered, the completeness or condition of the object, and this decision is made by a group of academics, curators, members of the antiquities trade, and also other learned members. So I think Lord Renfrew is still on the Treasure Valuation Committee. There is an agreement reached within the committee, and then this price effectively is sent to the museum saying, this is how much we've agreed, would you now raise the funds to pay for this object? And unfortunately in this case, Maidstone Museum were not able to fulfill the valuation, and so it moved towards being disclaimed, after which point I tried other museums, so the British Museum, and I then came to Kent Archaeology Society as an important local heritage body once it was clear that no accredited museum was able to purchase it. And I think that we use the TVC valuation for KAS to agree a price with on the object.
Okay, thanks, Joe. That's great. We've just had a communication actually from Gillian to say that the parish name is pronounced Elham, not Elham, which is something we were discussing yesterday.
Yes, and
what the actual pronunciation should be.
I had been pronouncing it Elham for quite a long time, and then got somewhat bamboozled with our discussions yesterday. Which is well, there's one of the great things about Kent is we do have some excellent parish names like Boughton Malaby, which I still can't pronounce.
Yes, absolutely. Trosley, yes. So, Joe, we keep talking about treasure, but what exactly is the definition of treasure? And lots of people, I think, still talk about things in terms of treasure trove, but I think that's not a term that we actually use now. Is that right?
Yeah. So what is treasure? Yeah, that's exactly right. So treasure trove is an interesting one, as it's still colloquially used by a lot of people, but is also not entirely to say that it isn't relevant, and we'll get to exactly why that is. So in 1996, the treasure trove laws were entirely rewritten as the Treasure Act, and this specified that any object over 300 years old, which is our first thing, and precious metal was to be considered treasure. So we've got silver, in this case a silver annular brooch, or gold. So we have these two lovely rings here, one of them being medieval, which is the top right, and the bottom one is the memento mori ring commemorating Jane Broadnax, which is now in the Heritage Centre at Godmersham Park. And that one's really interesting because it's connected to a person that we have historic records for. The other particular common group are groups of precious metal coins. So this is gold or silver in groups of 2 or more. So, you know, gold quarter staters, like in the bottom left, or hammered, what is referred to as hammered silver medieval coins, like this group in the top right. Also, it's a mixture of medieval and post-medieval coins there. And these have to be found in close association. Now, the trick here comes with what counts as close association, and it is dependent on where you are geographically in the period of time. So if you have a medium-sized field with 2 gold Iron Age coins at either side, there's a fairly good chance the curators of the British Museum will say they probably relate to each other, they're similar date, and go through. If you've got a medieval market site with lots and lots of silver coins scattered across it, there needs to be a much clearer association between the coins that are potentially treasure. And that is part of the treasure report writing process, is to make the argument to the coroner as to why these would qualify. The other group is base metal coins. So here we have the Thurnham hoard, which is a group of Iron Age cast pot-in bronze units. And this is a really good example of a group of base metal coins of 10 or more. Again, this can be tricky for Roman sites because you will have a Roman villa site or similar roadside site with huge scatterings of bronze coinage. And you have to have really clear indication as to why they're related. In this case, this is a nice pile of coins found roughly in a hole with actually quite a lot scattered in the other area, but they are all very similar related types with this dense concentration. So in the beginning of the 2000s, it was being realized that objects were being missed, important objects. Of particular note was groups of prehistoric metalwork, such as bronze axe hoards, like we have two here. And so it was decided that the Treasure Act was amended to include groups of 2 or more base metal objects of prehistoric date, and this is effectively prior to the Roman conquest. Now, there is some recent interesting interpretations of this law, because obviously the Romans show up in Kent in AD 43, but they weren't in northern Britain by that point. So there is, or what is now northern England at this point. And so exactly when prehistoric is again down to the report writing and the decision of the coroner in some ways. So this is a great example of prehistoric metalwork. This was reported to myself, and we were able to go out because the finder had left the signals that he could detect under the topsoil in situ. We were able to go out with a group of volunteers from the Sean Woods team and Andrew Mayfield, the community archaeologist for Kent, and excavate them. And we recovered 18 in total, but they are very varied. So in this group, we had a very homogeneous hoard of axes. We have mixtures of scrap objects in other hoards, ingots, or even very odd depositions. We had one hoard that one group of objects that went through the Treasure Act that were from a group of pits that were intercutting, but at the bottom of each one was a single pow stave. And here is one of those other oddities, which is a group of plate metal, which date into the Bronze Age. The other group of objects are those associated with treasure finds. So the Treasure Act specifies if there's any objects associated with the object that classifies as treasure, this will also be treasure. And this ranges from, ceramic vessels containing a hoard, in this case, a Bronze Age plate hoard within a pot, or base metal objects found with them. So we have a grave assemblage here from the Anglo-Saxon period. So we've got a lovely silver buckle and belt fittings, keystone garnet disc brooch with gilding, garnets and white inlay, and then a base metal copper alloy buckle, and together they form one treasure case. Now, trove. So trove isn't entirely gone. Anything that would have been covered by trove that isn't currently covered by the Treasure Act would still count as trove. So this is basically groups of precious metal that has been hidden with the intent to recover. I think the most famous one in recent years is the so-called piano hoard, where a group of late 19th to early 20th century gold sovereigns were found hidden under the keyboard of this piano, and that qualifies as trove, as clearly apparently someone was intending to retrieve this gold and never was able to, and no owner can be discovered. I don't know why I keep losing.
Thank you, Joe. That was really interesting and very, very helpful, I think. I believe the Treasure Act is currently being revised. Certainly there's a consultation that went out recently. What changes do you think we're going to see?
So that's a difficult question to answer, mainly because it went out to consultation. So the archaeologists got to suggest one thing, the academics got to suggest another thing, metal detectors got to suggest another thing, museums got to suggest another thing. One of the suggestions, and this is the one that is causing most interest for me in Kent, is single gold coins from the Roman period to roughly the 13th century. Now, for many parts of the country, this wouldn't be a huge addition to their workload, but I see maybe two gold Roman coins a year, often an Anglo-Saxon or early medieval tremesis, which is another gold coin, and one medieval gold coin. And it might be that this would increase my workload of treasure by upwards of 10% in a year. So it just depends on how many I find. So could be a significant increase for me. And there have been other attempts to make sure important objects like the Crosby Garret helmet, which is this amazing Roman cavalry helmet that was found, are protected for the public. Now, exactly how that is done is currently still being debated, and the DCMS, which is obviously, you know, has to try and take all of this on board, has tried to come up with a way of dealing with this, and there is, oh, if it's worth £10,000. But obviously there is, you know, an object that comes out of the ground is not likely to be worth that directly, but could be after it's been conserved. How as the flow is meant to know how much it's worth and that kind of thing. So it's an interesting process, and we'll have to see what they do. One of the other main things is to try and streamline the process, so trying to make the Treasure Act process a lot faster, a lot easier to go through. Currently there's quite a lot of backwards and forwards in between the flows, the finders, the coroners, the British Museum, and they tried to find some way of making this a bit easier for everyone involved. So we'll have to see what happens. Currently, they're still the government is still kind of mulling over what to do about it, really. And I think with COVID and various political things going on, they've had other things to distract them.
Indeed, indeed. That's been a lot of quite detailed information. Thank you very much, Joe. But so could we just sort of summarise this? If some general advice, if we find something that we think falls under the Act, what should we do?
So the Treasure Act specifies that if, from the point of which you suspect something might be treasure, you need to notify the coroner within 14 days of you suspecting it's treasure. In reality, in Kent, the coroner will direct you straight to me anyway. So it's best to get in contact with me, and we'll contact the coroner. And generally, as long as I've got all the information within that 14 days, we can get it processed all okay. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean the object has to be with me within those 14 days, but it does need to get to me within a reasonable time. Obviously, with COVID, that hasn't been able to be as simple. But, you know, as long as we've got all the information, we have a picture of the object, we've got a record of it, we can start processing it, and that's the important thing.
And does this, for those of us who are involved in fieldwork, does this apply to items found on excavations as well?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that I think some field archaeologists often forget, is this does apply to them. This is both in terms of commercial, community, and kind of academic digs. And you'd be amazed at how many particularly commercial units perhaps only realise an object is treasure a couple of years down the line once they're processing their post-ex. Now, in reality, a lot of units have particular fine staff that are the responsible treasure person, and often those units do have those treasure people are the people that always have them there on time. They notice them really quickly and they make sure the flow's aware. Now, the difference in this situation is that what happened, who writes the report and what happens to the object. As archaeologists, we don't want to disrupt kind of a site archive. So it's usually hoped that the agreement between the digger, well, the field unit or those carrying out the excavation, is that all objects found will be deposited with the site archive, regardless of whether or not they are treasure. So in this case, the object, if it was treasure, would be what we call disclaimed to the archive. So it will just be sent back to the archive and deposited with that wherever it ends up. This isn't always the case, and there are some long-running cases which I shan't mention, that there has been some discussion about what happens to the object now. The other point is about report writing. So often the units will produce a report on the object as part of their final post-ex and just kind of cut it out and send that to the British Museum for approval. And they publish their own reports that way. I haven't seen any of them be particularly edited by the curatorial staff, which is usually a good sign. But yeah, obviously the curatorial staff at the British Museum are the people responsible for signing off on reports, so reports may get changed.
And can you clarify what happens about rewards? Who gets these? Is it just automatic that the finder and the landowner get a 50-50 split?
So if the object is acquired under the Treasure Act, that is what the Treasure Act is set up to do. If the object is disclaimed, returned to the landowner, the finder, or the tenant, depending on what their prior agreements are, it's entirely down to them how they split the object, or if they were unfortunately to sell the object on the open market, how they split that money. But the kind of Treasure Act does kind of define, I think I've got a bit on that. Yes, define the kind of 50-50 split. Obviously, we're, you know, as archaeologists, we always want to see objects in museums, so they could be lovely displayed. This is a particularly great example of a hoard of late Roman silver, or the Canterbury hoard, which is on display. Bit before the Treasure Act, but I think it's a great example of how it's being displayed. There can be mitigating circumstances on how much the reward is paid to the landowner or the finder, depending on their actions. So if best practice wasn't followed, if the finder didn't have direct permission, if the tenant didn't have permission, and best practice could be everything of making sure it's reported on time, to making sure in situ archaeology isn't disturbed, making sure, you know, you abide by other kind of agricultural, you know, things such as stewardship, countryside stewardship, you know, RSPB sanctions as well on the land. So if there's rare nesting birds, if you've gone on detecting there and you find something, that might be taken in consideration as well.
Okay, it's interesting. I'm wondering about the scale of all this, Joe. How many treasure cases have you dealt with, do you think, since you've been Flow?
So I haven't done a full total, but we do have numbers. So this is something that I had to put together recently, actually, to work out how many treasure cases we're getting in Kent. Now, the treasure cases for 2020 and 2021, there is obviously a significant limitation on this because of COVID, and there is some late reporting of objects because of this. But these are all of the ones that have been reported from the county over the last 5-ish years. We frequently place in the top group of counties for the number of treasure cases reported, and frequently within the top 3 of those that only have one flow, as some counties have more than one, and therefore a little bit easier for them to process and do all of their jobs. 2017 was a bit of a trial by fire for me, as it was the year I started being on the flow full time. We had 81 treasure cases, which put us, I think, number 3 or 4. I think we're only 4 or 5 behind number 3 in the country. That included 9 Bronze Age hoards, I think, 5 of which came out of one weekend, which KAS helpfully, or members of KAS helpfully dealt with and have done so as further research of, which is the Battlesmere group. But we've had consistent increases, which obviously put pressure on me and the coroner's service. And we've recently been awarded some funding to recruit a treasure intern to help deal with this, and this includes writing up site reports for, you know, treasure cases where we've had to go out and do excavation work. I couldn't tell you how many treasure cases I've dealt with in total, as I've assisted other flows with treasure from their area, and I was actually my predecessor's intern and volunteer from 2014, and I was indeed helping them with treasure cases then as well.
Thank you. That's yeah, it's quite something to think about, and it's fantastic to hear that actually we've got extra funding to help to deal with this. I'm wondering, do you have any favourites amongst the cases you've dealt with? Was there anything that you'd like to highlight as particularly interesting or unusual?
Yeah, I mean, the treasure cases that often stick in my mind are ones that, for better or worse, have been complicated. Those that particularly have a particular resonance, so they're connected to historic people we've been able to track down, or even those that pertain to my particular interests, which are kind of object biography, and also, as we've mentioned, Garnet and early medieval jewellery. This is a particular recent one, which comes from the Isle of Sheppey, which is the East Church ring. I've managed to misspell East Church there, never mind, which is a beautiful late 15th, early 16th century hybrid of an iconographic kind of religious ring and a signet ring. The bull's head is a very interesting symbol, especially being found at Eastchurch, as it does have connections with the Blanng family, although the symbol's also associated with many other families that have bull in the tiles, so Bullcock and various other family names like this, because they were really into their puns at the time. And this one hasn't been, this kind of signet hasn't been found on any impressions from the Blanng family, so possibly not them, but it's a nice thing to think about, particularly as the family had connections with Eastchurch. This, which is fragments of the linen bucket, which is a Alresford Swaling type bucket, which is from the Iron Age. This was found with another bronze vessel, and is also the only example, which I'm afraid that our full images from this still haven't happened, but if we look at the right plate, there's a horse's head towards the left, and then a big fan-shaped tail, and it's actually the only representation of a hippocamp or seahorse in Latin art anywhere in Europe, other than on coins, and those coins are found in Kent. So it's an interesting little association. And the bucket itself has lots of repairs on, so there's a pair of these kind of figurative heads on each side, and fortunately I haven't got a picture of the one that I'm now going to be talking about, but the other one, this one has been repaired, so this bucket had quite a long life. This is the Hall Place hoard, which is the hoard we saw earlier, and this was just a great example of everything being done right. With the fight, unfortunately, a lot of Bronze Age hoards are found ploughed out or partially ploughed out, and people get quite carried away from them. So we don't always get to see them dug archaeologically. So it was really great for the finder to have stopped, looked at the 2 power staves he had from the plough soil, seen that he had signals further down, took a picture of everything, and emailed the flow, and we were able to get archaeological excavation out to go and look at this. And we learned all kinds of stuff with this power stave hoard, including how cold it was possible for archaeologists to work in before their brains stopped working, as we were trapped in the middle of a snowstorm towards the end of the day for this one. But luckily we had Sophie Adams came to the rescue late on in the day and was able to help us do the final bit of lifting, and was able to do a kind of mini excavation once we block lifted the final components of this hoard. If we can see the picture on the right is one of the axes, and we can really see the edge surviving there, so it's a great example. This is just been acquired by Canterbury Museums. This is a very rare Roman magic amulet, which is formed by 2 pieces of sheet gold pressed together and has kind of protective symbols around and attacking the evil eye, which is in the middle. So I think the only thing we can see really clearly of all of these is the scorpion, which is a kind of 9 o'clock, which is attacking the evil eye, but there's other things on there. There's a thunderbolt, there's an elephant, there's a winged phallus, and various other kind of what we call apotropaic or magical symbols that the Romans considered would bring them luck and fight off the evil eye. And then finally, this is another group of Anglo-Saxon material, which is actually in the collection of KAS. And this, unfortunately, was part of a grave disturbed by the finder, but it was just this brooch, this square-headed brooch that made up part of the assemblage, it's just one of my favorite objects I've ever seen. It's got that beautiful big mask of a dragon on, and I just kind of adore it.
That is, yes, it is wonderful. So obviously we know that this one has come into the KAS collection. What's happened to all these other treasure cases? I think you've alluded to this already, but how easy has it been to find suitable homes for them? So I don't think any of us we don't really like to think of these bits of our heritage being sold off in private hands, but we know that our museums are under very severe constraints.
Yeah, I think obviously I can't go into any separate museums and talk about how they're dealing with it, but I think one of the things that is quite telling is even years where we've only got maybe 40 or 50 cases in a year, we're possibly only looking at between 5 and 10% of those going into collections. Now, it's really important that they're still recorded with the PAS, so at least there's a permanent record of them. But there's potentially internationally important pieces, nationally important pieces, even regionally important objects that are just not getting into collections. Now, some finders, very kind, and landowners kindly donate objects, and this is could be a significant loss of money for them. Sometimes the objects are quite badly battered, so it's, they're slightly cheaper for museums, but there is a real problem with this, and I think this is a problem we see nationally. And obviously the other point is we don't have a full museum coverage of the county, so there's large swathes of the county, particularly in places like Swale, where there is no museum accredited that we can offer treasure cases to, and even if there was, there's a fairly good chance they wouldn't be able to afford to. And it's not always that the funds couldn't be raised, but it's also man hours. Curatorial staff have to make sure their collections are being presented well, make sure their collections are surviving, and all the other jobs that go along with it. So looking at to do funding applications to an object of treasure, which might need a kind of 6-month turnaround in the kind of funding bid, might not be viable for them. And that's something that, we'd hoped the Treasure Act would take into consideration, but it's one of those things that can be quite heartbreaking. Particularly, if you get things like this group of objects here, which almost didn't find a home.
Indeed, yes, it's almost a case of being a victim of your own success, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things that the PAS has done in general, is particularly for counties like Kent and other southeastern counties like Essex, Hampshire. We're high populations, high density of archaeology, and only one flow, and so there's only so much we can get recorded outside of treasure, and so there's always going to be a loss of data, and there's always just going to be a lot of people out there finding things. I should say not all of our objects are found by metal detectorists. We do find stuff by mudlarks. I've had numerous gold rings found in people's back gardens, or things like that, so it isn't just a metal detectorist.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Joe. I'm conscious of the need to move on, really, but I'm sure there'll be some more questions for you. So just a reminder, if you do have questions, to use the question and answer function at the top of your screen. But so now I'd like to ask Joe to talk in more detail about the Elham Cross itself. Thank you.
Yeah, so I have to admit, when I first saw this cross, I was kind of gobsmacked, and so a lot of my discussions on it can get a little bit passionate, so you'll have to forgive me if I go off too much on how much I like the object. So obviously, when you're looking at a stray find like this, you want to look at where it's come from within the landscape, and obviously I can't talk too much about that because we need to kind of protect the find spot itself. What I can say, it's on the top of a chalk ridgeway, with overlooking a valley, although you don't think you can directly see that from where it was found, but we've got very distinct geography. Archaeologically speaking, we haven't got anything clear within the immediate area, and the parish as a whole, while it has produced some sporadic early medieval material of a similar date, and indeed some quite impressively what people would term high status material, we're not seeing anything that wouldn't really be unusual for East Kent. So we now have to think about how the object fits the kind of wider metalwork and object types of the period. One thing that I should bring up, though, is one of the few objects that was found nearby was this tiny little squashed piece of gold, which is in fact another part of a Anglo-Saxon necklace. And actually, if we look at the reconstruction that was done, we can see some of these little bullet pendants placed, and this was found only a field away from the Elham pendant. And I only realised that when I was researching this this presentation. So although we can't say for certain, it's very possible that these could have been associated, whether or not with occupation, with unknown cemetery, or even with a kind of single necklace itself. Now, what I find quite interesting with the Elham Cross, this fragment and the reconstruction, is when we look at the Desborough necklace, which I believe Elizabeth mentioned, although not by name, we can start seeing how some of these necklaces may have been. Now, the Desborough necklace was found in the 19th century, and the exact position of all these elements within the grave are not known. So we don't know if it was one necklace or two necklaces, or how it was strung around the body. What we do know is it was in the grave of someone that appeared to be biologically female, and was apparently the only find within the grave, although again, with antiquarian excavations, there can be some real variety in the quality of their excavations. Now, The Desborough necklace is interesting because the cross is so plain. These kind of crosses are a known phenomena, particularly associated with the 7th century. So this is just after the Anglo-Saxons, or the century just after the Anglo-Saxons are officially beginning to convert, after the Augustine mission at the very end of the 6th century. There are a great swathe of varieties of these, often quite high quality, so gold, garnet. We do start seeing some similar features even across quite disparate groups. So if we have a look at the Cranmer House pendant, it is actually a cross. We can see with it the cross shape within the decoration there. Then we've got the more kind of cross-potent looking stuff with the Wilton cross, and the more recent trumpeting cross as well. We've got the lovely garnet and central decoration here. But if we look at the top of the Wilton cross, we have very similar loops going on. The trumpeting cross is quite different, as it appears to have been fastened or sewn onto a garment. There was a pair of linked gold and garnet linked pins found in the grave of the woman. However, it isn't clear how they all relate together, and it might be the linked pins are to do with the headdress, although I have heard a suggestion that maybe they're fastening the cross on, but I know there's a lot of disagreement with that. We then also have the the Thurnham cross, which is on the right here. This is the only known picture, which is unfortunately we don't know who the woman is, and we don't know what happened to the cross, unfortunately, as this is the image of it in the newspaper reports at the time, just before it was sold at Sotheby's. So if anyone does know what happens to it, I know myself and various other early medievalists like Helen Geek are quite keen to track it down. There's also the Ixworth cross, which again we see a loop with very large loop, but while not the lovely filigree ones of the previous examples, it has that still kind of similar kind of biconical with a rim at each end and a central ridge. And one of the I think the quite striking things amongst these is the use of garnet. Now, it would be remiss of us to not mention other pendants, as there is obviously overlaps. So if we see, this is the Wind Farthing assemblage that was reported as treasure about, I think, 8 years ago now. It was the grave of a high status woman, and we see another small filigree, what's called a pectoral cross here, some converted coin brooches and biconical beads. What I think is quite interesting is how similar these biconical beads are to the suspension loops we see on the previous crosses. There's also large decorative pendants of Milleforet glass. So this is from Silbert's Wold grave 172 in Kent, and there is a particular Milleforet type that we see a lot of in Kent. There's also the carnelian pendant, which has a very distinct kind of ribbed loop here, which is a very common type of loop to see on pendants in gold at the time. And as we can see, this was used, this kind of style of loop was used on the reconstruction. For those of you interested, the pendant on the kind of oval pendant there is reusing a Roman intaglio, probably in carnelian rather than garnet, and is also in was thankfully donated to Maidstone Museum, where you can go and see it. What I find very interesting, however, is the way that this has been set in the pendant, which is very similar to other some of the pectoral crosses. So there's definitely an overlap in the construction here. So one of the things that's very interesting with these objects is that all of those that have from sealed archaeological context, barring two, which I will mention, seem to be associated with women. Now, there is a lot of wealth buried with women during this period. From the 6th, maybe late 5th century onwards, we see consistently more wealth being buried than with men. Now, for a long time, there was a lot of questions where the material, like Sutton Hoo, was of the quality it was Sutton Hoo or Prittore was going, and then we're seeing stuff like the Staffordshire Hall found out. So there is kind of comparative masculine material or material associated with men out there. But there is this real show of kind of wealth within women's graves. And it's really interesting that we do get this overlap with these crosses, because women really drive the conversion in Anglo-Saxon England early on. We see first of all Augustine being invited over by Queen Bertha of Kent. We then also see powerful women founding monastic institutions like Kent St. Ainsworth. to the point of which, if one examines things like the Ecclesiastic Gentis Anglorum or the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, written by Bede several centuries later, we see at least 16 women in charge of abbeys, and this is roughly a third of all of the abbeys that he lists. And we have to also remember that these abbeys and these institutions aren't just religious houses, they are positions of power within the landscape, whether that's the social landscape, within that's literally the landscape itself and their kind of territorial holdings, or within the kind of economic landscape. So these are clear historic evidence of women in positions of religious power. And it's really interesting to see that association between these overtly religious pendants and this kind of period of time where women are holding such power. Now, after saying all of that, there are two notable exceptions here. One of which is the cross of St Cuthbert, which was found in the burial shroud of the remains of St Cuthbert at Durham Abbey when that was opened in the 19th century. Now, there has been some interesting discussions about why St Cuthbert was wearing this cross. You have to remember he is someone that eschewed earthly possessions and got close to God by standing in the sea and that kind of thing. So could this have been Cuthbert's cross? Well, it's been repaired quite a lot, and it has been worn quite a lot. There's quite a lot of patterns of wear on the reverse. The other example, and I'll get back to why it may or may not be his in a second. The other one is in the Staffordshire Hoard. Now, as we've said, the Staffordshire Hoard is a collection of overtly masculine objects, or objects that we would associate with men, you know, the kind of warrior class and that kind of thing. So what is this kind of pectoral cross, which is generally associated with women, doing there? Now, maybe they just happen to be in the loot, there happen to be material captured from a woman, but there is another object there which might explain this. Now, this thing bamboozled many early medievalists on its discovery. It's a beautiful piece of garnet cloisonné filigree and glasswork, but it has been identified as part of a priest's garment. Now, there is other overtly religious things in there in the Staffordshire Hoard, such as the processional cross, that might also be a priestly. So it's possible that a few of these crosses are associated with men, but their overt association with women may also be kind of speaking to the Anglo-Saxons' attitude to priests in general. We know that some Anglo-Saxon priests, references to Anglo-Saxon priests, although pagan ones, seem to imply that they cannot perform the usual duties of men. They weren't allowed to ride stallions, for example, and so it might be we may be having a glimpse into how the Anglo-Saxons were interpreting gender representation, or even how their priestly classes fitted into that. But two objects, however, do not really draw much conclusion, but I think that's a really interesting association there. I'm going to just cover a last few bits here, which are more to do with kind of my general musings about the cross, the condition of the cross, and indeed some elements of it. So the gold and kind of garnet technique is something that I think we all recognise as kind of iconically Anglo-Saxon. One of the things that is notable, however, is in the 7th century, despite having the kind of pinnacle of the craft with, you know, Sutton Hoo, the Staffordshire Hoard, and the kind of really high status cloisonné kind of composite brooch series, which is still associated with Kent, we do begin to see a drop in the quality of materials towards the middle of the 7th century. We're seeing more obviously recycled material. The garnets seem to not be fitting so well. The cloisonné is more kind of less well executed. They're shoving kind of bits and bobs in to try and keep the garnets in, and the cloisonné can not properly fit them. There's a great art example here, which is the Milton brooch, which is now in the Victorian Museum. So could the Elham Cross be an example of an object that's being broken down for this? Well, I think we can't really be. Oh, wait, here. Yes, there are, in fact, examples of other pectoral crosses where they've clearly had been kind of fit this kind of slightly ropey construction. Here's the example from the Holden-esque cross, where the garnet is clearly poorly executed. The central stone isn't properly set, and indeed the kind of engraving in the middle relates to a type of kind of counter inlay where gold or even enamel would be inlaid into the garnet, but really relates to kind of mid 6th century technique when these crosses are generally dated to the 7th century to kind of coincide with the Christianization of the country. Now, Elham Cross, the damage here we cannot be certain has happened before it went into the ground, but it very well may have been. There were similar kind of breaks on some of the material within the Staffordshire hoard, and one would be surprised if all of this damage was purely from the plough. The other point is the central cabochon here. So this kind of flat-topped stone is very, very easy to find comparisons within, particularly Kentish archaeology. So these kind of keystone garnet disc brooches are very popular in the middle of the 6th century, and here we have one with a very similar stone from grave 44 at Lyminge, which is now in KAS's collection. These are particularly common on this type, but they are increasingly rare after the middle of the 6th century, and we may be seeing reuse of the Elham Cross. We might be seeing the Elham Cross using one of these early ones. So we're seeing two lots of reuse. We're seeing the reuse of the materials in the construction of the cross, and then the Elham Cross being cut up for yet more reuse. And the reason why I think it's really important to highlight particularly this kind of stone is that they are circulating within Northern Europe, and particularly we see them here in Kent, after the kind of production of the stones begins to falter. Now we know these stones are being produced not in Europe. These are a kind of intaglio stones, so the kind of Roman signet rings that are being produced in the 4th and 5th centuries in Sasanian Persia. As the fashion for intaglio stones falls, you see the jewelers and various other people starting to trying to come up with a way of dealing with this clearly massive backlog of these stones. So we start seeing the earliest cloisonne utilizing these intaglio stones. So I think this is a really interesting point to put the cross into context. There is another potential explanation for the use of that central stone. Is the Elham Cross could be earlier. Now, these pictorial crosses, I've said, tend to be dated to the 7th century, and I know I do apologise. I'm having a bit of a kind of ramble here around my ideas on this because I've only kind of really been thinking about this in the last couple of days. But the cross itself and the filigree on this cross does suggest it is one of the earlier examples. The execution is somewhat better than some of the later ones. The kind of if honest, is also a little bit of gut feeling here. It just feels earlier. Now, we know that Christianity, despite what Bede and his contemporaries would like to think, had survived in Britain after the Romans left. You know, places like St Albans survive as Christian shrines. And we know there's quite a lot of marrying backwards and forwards across the channel. It could be that, you know, Frankish ideas of Christianity were coming in before Augustine's mission. Could this have been a cross belonging to a Christian before Augustine? I think I'd be pushing it to say yes or no, but I just thought it was an interesting idea to raise, and maybe that central garnet is more contemporary with those earlier disc brooches. So thank you for listening to me. If you do have any queries about treasure or finds recording in Kent, do email me, flo@kent.gov.uk. As always, support your local museums and archaeological societies. A lot of them are struggling right now. Keep track of both KAS and me on Twitter as well. And I think I'll hand back to Elizabeth now for some questions.
Okay, thank you very much. That's absolutely fascinating. And there's clearly a lot more thought that needs to go into this item. This is a huge amount of potential in it. So everyone, I'm conscious of the fact that Joe and I between us have actually talked for a rather long time, but we do have a few questions. So if people want to stick around, we will deal with some of the questions that we've had. So the first question we had was, could an individual with an interest pan county. So I think you were talking about how the whole county isn't covered by museums.
Yes.
So and becomes certified to purchase, but it
Yeah.
does use the word individual. So
yeah, I mean, the Treasure Act is set up to make sure objects get into public collections. So this is museums, and this is why everyone that is allowed to acquire through the Treasure Act has to be accredited by the Museums Association. I wouldn't be actually surprised if it'd be something worth KAS working towards in the long run, as you know, places like Hampshire Trust and Sussex Archaeological Society are accredited. But yeah, it's not something that an individual would be allowed to do, I'm afraid, and not something I'm afraid I would encourage either.
No, quite. And another question, I think Anders actually did answer this on the chat, but just for the benefit of those who aren't following. Also, did you say that the Elham Cross was Saxon, and would the location not appear in the Exploring Kent's Past website?
No, the data set of the PAS is a fantastic tool. It's possible, you know, the envy of Europe in some ways. Unfortunately, the Dutch are catching up with their PAN system, but the material goes into the Kent's HER, but on a layer that isn't visible to members of the public. You need to kind of be kind of vetted individuals to be able to use the past data set, and this cross went onto the past data set. There has only been 2 locations that I think have been recent finds that have gone on there, and they were emergency ones ahead of planning, just to make sure that they were there and visible within the data set, and they were subsequently removed.
Right. Okay. And I think the same question as that said. I think asking whether the Roman hoard from Bridhurst, believed to be a Legionnaire's stash, would that be treasure trove, please? Or would it be trove, please?
I don't. There's a lot of hoards from Kent. If it was found prior to 1996 and it was precious metal, so denarii or siliqua, or the gold equivalents, then yes, it should have gone through as trove. Whether or not it did or not is a different matter, particularly for older assemblages. If it's a site find, I don't. Does anyone in the chat know what date the Bridhurst hoard was found?
Somebody might mention it later, but I haven't got. We can come back to that if somebody answers that. Yeah. Somebody else is asking, why is one rare gold coin of any age not treasure?
The answer is the Iron Age. And the proliferation of material in the post-medieval period. So the Iron Age, I think I've had discussions on this recently. In Kent, in particular, we have, in terms of single gold Iron Age coin finds, they're just not that rare. And one of the key things with the Treasure Act is making sure material that you know, public good and be safe for the public good. So there's only so much we can do in that regards. And for example, if we were to search Stater, which is a gold coin on the PAS database, nationally, single coins, there's 21,000. So they're using gold much more prolifically during the Iron Age. In the post-medieval period, the coinage is being produced at a phenomenal rate as well. I think there could be arguments for gold coins, particularly up until the coming of milled coinage under Charles II to probably go through, but there's only so much that could be done by myself. And as you may have guessed from my discussions on Roman gold single coins, I'm not sure I'm totally on board with that, although I'm sure that Dr. Sam Moorhead of the British Museum would rap me across the knuckles for saying so.
And I suppose this also goes back to the thing that, you know, we're talking about archaeological treasure, aren't we? Which is why we're expanding the definition to non-precious metals, because it's not just the fact that it is gold. It's the archaeological significance of the item, which has been recognised by the Act.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things with the Treasure Act is it did give impetus for the existence of the PAS in terms of treasure finds. I should say the Treasure Act I forgot to mention this, only covers England and Wales. So in Scotland, they've got a form of treasure trove law, which basically covers everything that's old under their scheme, but they've got far fewer people metal detecting. So there has to be a balance really between what we can achieve using the voluntary skill of the PS and what we can enforce under law if metal detecting is not going to be licensed effectively, which, you know, is a whole other debate. So it's a complicated subject, and one I have to, you know, be wary of my answers on, because I will almost certainly tread on someone's toes, whether they be archaeologist, metal detectorist, or auctioneer, or member of the DCMS. But it's one that's constantly up for debate, and I think if one is interested in, there is a book called the Treasure and the Law, or the Treasure Act and the Law, which is worth a read if one wants to get their head around both the way it functions and the kind of arguments to and fro.
I've just seen actually the same questioner has actually has elaborated and said my question was referring to rare gold coins.
Well, the question therefore comes down to what classify exactly as rare, because what, you know, there's plenty of coins that are still listed as rare within numismatic literature, which thanks to metal detecting over the last 15-20 years aren't. There was a recent find of a very rare Carausius gold coin which found in Kent, which still disappointed never got to see in person, that really should have been in a collection in Kent, but unfortunately was sold on the private market. And that is the kind of coin that change the Treasure Act could help. And, you know, that coin has a really interesting story to tell about the kind of breakaway Britannic Empire. But yeah, it's a difficult question, and one that I frequently have numismatists who are the guys that study coins.
I'm glad to say we've got David Holman with us tonight, who has just posted that the Bredgar hoard, not Breedhurst, was found in 1957.
Okay,
so that answers that question. Now this, somebody's asked what happens to a gold coin found on an archaeology dig.
It should go into the archive as any other find. If the Treasure Act changes its definition and we start seeing single gold coin finds classified as treasure, regardless of whether or not we consider Iron Age coins or post-medieval coins get folded into that, hopefully they don't, because the amount of paperwork will drive me mad. But they would still be, you know, the law would still apply for that to them in those circumstances.
Okay, now there's one here that I think is more directed towards me. Is the KAS collection catalogued and the catalogue accessible? Does it say what, if anything, may be viewed and where and when? That's an extremely good question. There is the old original 1890s catalogue in an early edition of Archaeologia Kantiana. The cataloguing of the KAS collection is problematic. It's a very long-lived collection. It is in Maidstone Museum. Over the years, in the past, it was very common for the KAS curator and the museum curator to be the same person, and generally over the last century or so, the collection has got a bit mixed in with the Maidstone Museum holdings. So Maidstone Museum, with the aid of some KAS volunteers, has recently, they've not finished yet, they've finished the archaeological collections, I believe, been doing a huge audit of the collections, and there is now a database which contains all the KAS material. It's not in a publishable state, I'm afraid. It's still got a lot of data cleaning to go through, so it is not published. I hope very much that we will be able to do this and we'll be able to get something which is accurate and coherent and can be published on the web. Ultimately, I mean, my desire, my real wish is that we could actually digitize the collection itself and have the articles themselves, or a substantial number of them, because there's also a lot of corroded metal, for instance, and potsherds. But that so we could have the the highlights of the collection available online, but that's a long-term goal. The articles that are on show are in the archaeology gallery at Maidstone Museum, so they're available during normal museum opening hours. Right, I'm writing a paper for a PhD which should rewrite history. Could I go through my university to access the PAS?
Yes, you would send an email to the central unit, and that passed PAS data set, as long as your lecturer kind of vouches for you, your supervisor, that should be viable. Although there will be restrictions on exactly what you can do with it and what data you're given.
Thank you. And now somebody has asked, is it known whether garnets had a special significance or meaning to people at this time, other than its value or attractiveness in a creative?
Yeah, so this is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and there is a great deal of debate about this. I think one of the things we cannot overlook is the sheer number of garnets being produced and exported along the Silk Road into the Mediterranean and Europe during the period. There was, I think, the supply helped them become popular because they're a lovely shiny stone and they contrast really well with gold. I don't think we can deny that. Red is important though, and we do see this in Ireland where they're trying to replicate garnets, so it's still seen as an important colour. Exactly why, we're not certain. But one of the things to remember is how good it is to contrast them. If you look at Old English, there's a real kind of predilection for talking in contrasts and kind of descriptive qualifiers when you're talking about colour that almost always feel very contrast focused, which is interesting, and there are some great papers on there out there on that. My particular, one of the greatest examples is that kind of red as blood, white as snow kind of attitude, and you often see, particularly with the 6th and early 7th century material garnet, paired with kind of a white collar or white substance to really contrast with it and with the gold itself. It is worth noting that while garnet is popular across Northern Europe, there are parts of kind of Western Europe that don't do that. So there's a real much more polychrome metalwork going on in Spain during this time. They're using a lot more glass, and glass in Anglo-Saxon jewelry tends to be quite sparsely used in contrast to the garnet. So basically, probably, we're not certain is the answer.
Okay, here's a good question. How do you become a flow?
One of the things that, if you get to know the PAS and ever record with more than one flow or go to a conference and see different flows talking, is almost every flow is different. I had a commercial archaeological background, and then was always more interested in objects, particularly of the Anglo-Saxon period, and then went and did a master's in artifact studies. Other flows have come from curatorial backgrounds. We even had one flow that was just really good with was really good with big data and databases, and became and was originally a GeoArch and just kind of stepped sideways into kind of finds and data analysis. So basically, there's lots of routes, but the important things are liking objects and liking people.
Absolutely. And an interesting question from Anders here. What can the KAS do to support the PAS scheme? So that's one for you and I to discuss, I think. But
well, I think we've had quite a lot of, there was support with the Battles Mill Hoards. That was really important on the day. There's, pointing people in my direction. If they email the KAS, what's this, that kind of thing. I think I've had quite a few. I think I've had 3 different African spears come through the KAS that way, which is feeding into a new interest of mine. But it's that, and encouraging best practice, whether that's with metal detectorists, whether that's with archaeologists making sure, you know, community projects report treasure. And we had an, you know, a hoard of Roman coins from Otford last year, which was, you know, good best practice being involved there. And also making sure those links between metal detectorists and archaeologists are there. You know, like a lot of metal detectorists are really enthusiastic, and you'd be amazed at the difference a metal detectorist who knows what they're doing, knows their machine, will make on an archaeological dig site in terms of recovery.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's the end of the questions actually, and I'm very impressed actually. I think we've had up to about 61 attendees here, and 45 of you have stuck it out despite us taking up an inordinate amount of time here. So thank you very, very much, Joe, for giving us all this amazing information. And thank you very much to all of you who have attended and all of you who have asked questions. I hope you found it interesting. And as the late Dennis Norton used to say, if you have been, thanks for listening. Good night.